The House of Mirrors. The wrench connected with the door handle at precisely 7:47 a.m., and Elena Henderson, standing barefoot in a guest room on the second floor of her own house, watched it hang from a single wire like a severed limb. Below her, 3 police officers in blue uniforms were already moving through the living room. The sirens outside had stopped wailing. Her sister Sarah's face was frozen in that photograph on the investigator's screen. And in her pocket, the digital recorder contained Martha's voice saying words that would, by nightfall, destroy 4 lives entirely. But this had not started as a revolution. It had started as coffee. 13 hours earlier. The silver DeLonghi espresso machine hummed and vibrated under Elena's slim fingers, the ones adorned with nothing but a simple gold wedding band. She pressed the start button and watched the machine come alive, steam rising from the nozzle in thin, delicate wisps. The kitchen was hers alone. White marble countertops, white subway tile backsplash, the kind of sterile perfection that magazines wanted to photograph. She leaned against the counter, her white silk robe falling loose around her shoulders, and stared at a small ceramic succulent pot that Mark had brought home 3 years ago. It had died within a week. The coffee dripped steadily into the small white cup below. Drip, drip, drip. The rhythm was almost meditative. Outside the bay window, the morning was clear and bright, the kind of Saturday morning that suggested nothing terrible would happen, the kind of morning that lies to you. Then came the sound, a loud metallic clack from the front door, the deadbolt turning. Then the heavy door swinging open. Elena's head snapped toward the hallway, her eyes widening. Her reflection in the microwave glass suddenly looked like a stranger's face. She didn't need to call out. She already knew. Martha Henderson walked into the kitchen wearing a beige trench coat, her posture perfectly upright, her shoulders held back in that military way that made Elena think of a prison guard. She was holding a set of silver keys, and without ceremony or greeting, she dropped them onto the marble island with a loud, deliberate bang. "Elena, dear," Martha said, her smile tight and practiced, her eyes moving across her daughter-in-law with the precision of a jeweler examining a counterfeit diamond. "Still in your robe? It's nearly 8. Elena reached for the espresso cup. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the handle, and she turned to face her mother-in-law. The coffee was hot enough to hurt, but she held it anyway. "Martha, you didn't call. Again." Martha's smile didn't waver. It never wavered. It was. Elena had come to understand over the 7 years of her marriage to Mark, the smile of someone who had never been told no and couldn't comprehend why she should start being told no now. "I have a key, dear," Martha said, her fingers trailing across the marble island. "It's my son's house." Elena said nothing. She drank her coffee. It was too hot, and it burned the roof of her mouth. But she drank it anyway because showing pain in front of Martha was showing weakness. And weakness in front of Martha was like showing blood to a shark. Martha moved deeper into the house. The master bedroom was on the second floor, 3 doors down from the hallway where Elena kept her personal office, the one with the gold-headed key that only she possessed. Or so she had thought. Martha was already pulling open the double doors of the walk-in closet when Elena found her, black velvet hangers clattering as they hit the floor. "This closet is a disaster area," Martha announced, as though she were a structural engineer surveying a condemned building. "Mark can never find his shirts." Elena entered the closet and saw the pile of her own dresses, silk, linen, carefully chosen pieces that she had collected over years, tumbling onto the gray carpet like abandoned children. Her chest began to heave. There was something about watching someone else touch your things that made your nervous system register it as violence. "What are you doing?" Elena's voice came out low and dangerous. Martha was standing on the top shelf's lower rung, reaching for something on the very top, the blue, leather-bound photo album. The one that contained pictures Elena had never shown anyone. Images of her mother, who had died 12 years ago. Images of Elena as a child, before she learned to pretend. Before she met Mark. "Give me that. Now." Martha pulled the album away, tucking it under her arm like a football. She tried to push past Elena, tried to use her shoulder as a battering ram, tried to occupy space in a way that said, "I belong here more than you do. I'm just seeing what you've kept." Martha's voice rose into a screech that Elena's ears would still be ringing with hours later. "I have a right to see family history." Elena lunged. Her hands found Martha's wrists. They were thin, bird-like wrists, and they were no match for the adrenaline that had just flooded Elena's bloodstream. They wrestled in the close space of the closet, their bodies brushing the hanging clothes, and Elena felt her shoulder hit the door frame. The impact sent a spark of pain down her spine. She didn't care. She shoved Martha back with her forearm, using all her weight, and Martha lost her balance entirely. Martha fell backward into the pile of dresses. The blue album flew from her hand and hit the wall with a dull thud. She stared up at Elena from the floor, her hair disheveled, her breathing ragged. Elena could see a thin red scratch on her wrist where Elena's fingernails had caught her. "You..." Martha's voice came out in a whisper, venomous and sharp as a blade. "You laid hands on me. You're unstable." Elena didn't respond. She simply walked out of the closet, stepped over the pile of clothes, and went downstairs. The console table by the front door held keys, loose change, unopened mail. Elena's hands were shaking as she opened the drawer and began digging through the papers. Bills, credit card statements, the detritus of a life that suddenly felt like it was being lived behind glass. At the very back, behind a collection of warranty cards she'd saved for no good reason, she found a small velvet pouch. It was midnight blue, the kind of pouch that usually contained jewelry. She tipped it over. A silver key fell out. Then a folded yellow receipt. Elena unfolded the receipt. Her eyes moved across the text. Ace Hardware. Date, yesterday. Item, 5 sets of key duplicates. Customer, Mark Henderson. 5 sets. 5. She looked at the silver key. It wasn't for the front door. Her front door key was larger, brass-colored. This one was smaller, with a distinctive gold head. It was the key to her personal home office in the basement. The room where she kept her files. Her computer. The financial records she'd been updating for the past 2 months because Mark had never been good with numbers. Elena clutched the receipt and the key in her fist. She looked at the stairs leading down. The realization hit her like a physical object. The intrusion wasn't random. It wasn't Martha being her usual obnoxious self. It was systematic, planned, deliberate. And the fact that there were 5 sets of keys meant that Martha and Arthur hadn't come alone. There were others. There was someone else involved in this. She looked at herself in the mirror that hung in the hallway. The woman looking back at her was wearing a white silk robe and had coffee stains on her chin. That woman looked like a stranger. That evening, when Mark came home from his job at the insurance company, a job he'd held for 5 years and that Elena had never quite believed was real, Martha and Arthur were still in the house. They were in the living room, sitting on the sofa like they owned it, which perhaps Elena was beginning to understand. They believed they did. Elena had spent the afternoon gathering information. She had opened every drawer in the kitchen, every cabinet, every closet. She had looked at the bank statements. She had examined the deed to the house. She had read the letter from the attorney that arrived in a thick envelope marked private and confidential. Now she sat across from Mark at the dinner table. Martha and Arthur flanked them like bookends. A roast chicken sat in the center, untouched. Rain was lashing against the bay window behind them, and thunder rumbled in the distance, rolling across the sky like something alive and angry. Elena pulled the yellow receipt from her pocket and slammed it onto the table. It skidded toward the gravy boat and knocked against it. Brown sauce splashed across Mark's blue shirt, leaving a spreading stain that looked like a map of a country that didn't exist. 5 keys, Mark, Elena said, her voice steady and cold as winter. Explain them. Now. For a moment, no one moved. The rain continued its assault on the window. Mark's mouth opened and closed like a fish that had been removed from water. Then Arthur stood up so fast, his chair tipped over backward with a crash. Don't you talk to my son like that in his own house? Arthur's voice boomed across the table, his face turning the color of a tomato that had been left in the sun too long. He was a burly man with thick, calloused hands and a checkered shirt that strained against his belly. He reached across the table, his hand outstretched, aiming for Elena's wrist. Elena ducked under his arm. Her hand closed around a wine glass. It was full, red wine, the kind that stained. She threw the contents directly into Arthur's face. He yelped and staggered backward, blinded. Elena pushed the heavy oak table with all her strength. It slid across the hardwood floor with a screech of wood on wood, pinning Arthur against the sideboard behind him. His hands came up to his face, trying to wipe the wine from his eyes. Elena stood up. She picked up a silver dinner fork and pointed it at Mark. Her hand was perfectly steady. Get them out, she said quietly. If you don't, I will use the police and a crowbar, and I will use them tonight. Mark's hands were already raised, palms outward, a gesture of surrender that came far too late. Arthur was gasping, trying to push the table back, wine dripping from his eyebrows in thin red rivulets. But neither of them moved to leave. That night, Elena discovered that the locks had been sabotaged. Both the front door and the back kitchen door, the only exits from the house, had been disassembled from the inside. The mechanism was gone. The brass knobs turned freely, engaging nothing, locking nothing. Tiny metal shavings covered the hardwood floor beneath them, glinting in the light like evidence of a crime. She found a yellow-handled screwdriver under the radiator. In the guest room upstairs, she could hear laughter. Martha's high-pitched cackle mixed with Arthur's gravelly roar. They had settled in. They had no intention of leaving. Elena was beginning to understand, with a clarity that felt almost like standing outside her own body, trapped her in her own house. The basement was dark, lit only by the glow of the water heater's pilot light. Elena crept past the humming machinery and reached for the small rectangular window set high in the concrete wall. It was covered in cobwebs, and dust particles danced in the thin beam of moonlight that penetrated from outside. She pulled a wooden crate over and stood on it, stretching her fingers toward the window frame. A hand grabbed her ankle and yanked. She crashed down onto the concrete floor with an impact that knocked the air from her lungs. Her chin hit hard, hard enough that she tasted blood. She scrambled to turn over, to see who had grabbed her. But a shadow was already falling over her face. Mark was standing above her, holding a length of duct tape in one hand and a heavy maglite flashlight in the other. His face was blank, devoid of any emotion she recognized. It was the face of someone who wasn't home anymore. "Mom says you need to rest," he said, his voice monotone and eerie. "You're making a scene, Elena." Arthur stepped out from behind the furnace, and Elena's survival instinct activated like a switch being flipped. She kicked out, catching Mark in the shin. He yelped and doubled over. Elena scrambled to her feet and grabbed a heavy orange bottle of laundry detergent. She flung it at Arthur's head. It connected with a dull thunk, and blue liquid exploded across his shoulder. But there were two of them, and one of her. Arthur tackled her into the washing machine. The metal groaned under the impact. He pinned her arms behind her back, pressing her face against the vibrating metal so hard that her teeth rattled. She could see her own distorted reflection in the machine's surface. A wild-eyed stranger. "Keep quiet," Arthur growled, his breath hot against her ear. "Or I'll make sure you never walk out of this basement." She stopped struggling. There was no point. Not yet. At 4 a.m, Martha brought tea. Elena was sitting on the floor of the guest room, her back against the bed, her wrists red and chafed from where Arthur had bound them with duct tape before leaving her here. The door opened, and Martha entered carrying a floral tea set. Delicate china with pink roses painted on the sides. She set it on the nightstand and pulled a small glass vial from her apron pocket. Elena watched as Martha uncapped the vial. 3 drops of clear liquid fell into the teacup. Drip, drip, drip. The liquid dispersed in the hot tea, leaving concentric circles that spread and vanished. "This will help with the nerves," Martha said, her voice taking on that sickly sweet clinical tone that made Elena's skin crawl. "We've already called the clinic. They're coming at 10. Clinic. The word hung in the air like a threat. Martha leaned in close. She pulled a folded document from her apron pocket. It was a deed of sale for the house, already signed. Elena could see Mark's shaky signature at the bottom. Below it, another signature, Arthur's, in bold block letters. "You were never good enough for him," Martha whispered in Elena's ear. "This house, the money, it's coming home to where it belongs." Then Elena saw it. Around Martha's neck, the pearl necklace, the one from Elena's dead mother. Guilt, maybe. Cowardice, definitely. Then he looked away. He picked up her suitcase, already packed with her belongings, clothes, her toiletries, her shoes. Someone had gone through her drawers and chosen what she would be allowed to take. "It's better this way," Mark said, his voice faint and shaky. "Mom says you'll get the help you need." Elena tried to speak, but her tongue wouldn't cooperate. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, but Mark's hand was faster. He slipped it into his pocket, the pocket of the shirt she had bought him for his birthday, the one he said he loved. She collapsed onto the carpet. The door swung shut and she heard the lock click from the outside. Darkness started closing in from the edges of her vision, creeping inward like a tide. This is where most stories end. This is where the protagonist is supposed to surrender, to accept her fate, to become a minor character in someone else's narrative. But Elena had built this house. She had designed it, and during the remodel 3 years ago, she had insisted, over Mark's objections, on installing an emergency plumbing access in every bedroom, including this one. Her eyes snapped open. She vomited into the small trash can beside the bed, purging the drugged tea in violent heaves that left her gasping and shaking. Her hands were trembling, but her mind, that was sharpening, clearing, becoming focused like a lens coming into focus. She crawled to the closet. She pushed aside a panel in the floor, the one Mark had complained about a dozen times because it was ugly, and why did we need that? Inside was the hidden landline she had never disconnected from the old phone system. She had kept it because something in her, some instinct she didn't have a name for, had told her to keep it. Her fingers found the numbers. She pressed 0 for the operator. "Operator? This is Elena Henderson at 44 Willow Lane. I have intruders. I am being held against my will. I need police. I need them now." Her voice was clear. steady, the voice of someone who had made a decision and was seeing it through to the end. The police arrived 23 minutes later. But before they arrived, Elena had other things to do. The metal wrench was kept in the plumbing access, part of the emergency kit the contractors had installed. Elena pulled it out and held it in both hands. She walked to the guest room door, the one that Martha had locked from the outside, and swung the wrench with all the force she could muster. The handle cracked under the blow. On the second swing, it gave way entirely, hanging by a single wire. She kicked the door open. It hit the wall with a bang that echoed through the house. Elena stood in the hallway, the wrench in her right hand, her face smeared with sweat and the remnants of dried tears. She was wearing nothing but an old t-shirt and underwear, and her hair was matted to her scalp. She looked like she had crawled out of a war. She descended the stairs. Martha and Arthur were in the entryway, speaking in low tones to two men wearing polo shirts with Mountain View Wellness embroidered on the chest. Mark was nowhere to be seen. The moment he heard Elena's footsteps, Arthur looked up. Elena reached the bottom of the stairs. She raised the wrench. "Nobody moves?" she said. The front door exploded inward exactly 48 seconds later. Police officers in blue uniforms poured through the opening, guns drawn but held at the ready. Elena dropped the wrench immediately, raising her hands in surrender. The officers moved past her without laying a hand on her, their weapons trained on Martha, Arthur, and the two clinic employees. Martha began screaming. She pointed at Elena with a shaking finger and started gasping, her other hand clutching her chest. She was performing a heart attack, Elena realized with a kind of detached clarity. She was trying to turn this into a scene where she was the victim. Elena reached into her t-shirt and pulled out the small digital recorder she had hidden under the guest room bed 6 hours earlier. She pressed play. Martha's voice filled the entryway, preserved in crystal clarity on the recording. "This house, the money. It's coming home to where it belongs." The screaming stopped. An officer clicked handcuffs onto Mark's wrists. He had emerged from the kitchen at the sound of the sirens, his face pale and drawn. He started crying, his body shaking as the officer led him toward the door. Arthur was pinned against the wall by two officers, his face pressed into the plaster as they secured his hands behind his back. Martha was still performing, still gasping, still pointing at Elena. Elena walked directly to her. She reached out and yanked the pearl necklace from Martha's neck. The silk string snapped under the violence of the gesture, and pearls scattered across the hardwood floor, rolling in all directions like tiny white survivors of a disaster. "Don't ever touch my things again," Elena whispered. And the words carried a weight that made Martha stop screaming. The house was silent once they were gone. Elena spent the next 3 hours cleaning. She moved through the rooms with methodical precision, filling black trash bags with the debris of the invasion. The floral tea set was the first thing to go. She smashed it piece by piece and listened to the ceramic shatter. There was something deeply satisfying about the sound of destruction, about taking something beautiful and making it into nothing. She sat at the kitchen island with her laptop. She opened the bank portal with trembling fingers. The transfer to Arthur had been reversed, marked as fraudulent. The balance was back to $45,000. The bank's fraud detection system had flagged the transaction within minutes of it being made. A single massive transfer to an account in a different state. From a joint account belonging to a woman with no history of large withdrawals. The bank had frozen it, investigated, and determined it was theft. Elena stared at the number for a long time. Then she opened an email from the private investigator she had hired 3 weeks ago. A woman named Catherine Wells, who had a reputation for being thorough and discreet. The email contained a single attachment. a photograph from a bank 2 weeks ago. Martha and Mark standing at a teller window. And between them, smiling with the kind of smile Elena knew intimately, the smile of someone who thought they were winning, was Sarah, Elena's sister, her only sibling. The person Elena had called first after she married Mark. The person she had told about the honeymoon plans. The person she trusted with the key to her house in case of emergency. Sarah, who worked in event planning. Sarah, who had access to Elena's calendar and knew when she was out of the house. Sarah, who had always been jealous of Elena's marriage, Elena's house, Elena's money. Sarah, who had apparently decided that the fastest way to get what she wanted was to steal it from someone else. Elena picked up her phone. She dialed Sarah's number. It rang 3 times before Sarah answered. Elena, oh my God, I heard about the police and... I'm sending a car for you, Elena said, her voice smooth and controlled. We need to talk about Martha. There was a pause. Just a moment of hesitation, but it was enough. Sarah, Elena continued, I know everything, and I have photographs, and I have access to the same bank records that the police are looking at right now. So you can either come here and we can discuss this in private, or you can wait for the police to knock on your door. Another pause. The car will be there in 20 minutes. Elena hung up. She took a long sip of her espresso. The cup was the one she had used that morning, before Martha arrived, before everything changed. It was a simple white cup with a gold rim. She had bought it years ago at a market in Barcelona, long before she met Mark, when the world was still a place where things were hers alone. She walked to the window and looked out at the garden. The storm had passed. The grass was still wet, but the sun was bright and clear. Everything looked exactly as it had that morning, except nothing would ever be the same again. She returned to the kitchen and placed the gold wedding band on the counter. Then she picked up the trash bag she had filled with the broken tea set and carried it out to the garbage bin. When she came back inside, she picked up the ring and held it in the palm of her hand. It was warm from the morning sun. She looked at it for a long moment, then walked to the kitchen sink and opened the garbage disposal. The ring tumbled down into the darkness with a barely audible clink. She pressed the switch and listened to the grinding sound, the terrible churning of metal on metal, until the disposal fell silent and the ring was simply gone. The doorbell rang at 9:47 a.m. Sarah stood on the doorstep wearing a designer dress and sunglasses, even though the sun wasn't particularly bright. She looked like a woman who was about to ask for money, rather than a woman who had just committed fraud. Elena stepped aside and let her in. They didn't speak. They moved into the living room, and Elena pulled up the photographs on her laptop. She played the recording. She showed Sarah the bank statements and the hire records and the timeline of when the keys had been made. Sarah's face went very pale. "What are you going to do?" she finally asked, her voice small and thin. Elena didn't answer immediately. She closed the laptop and looked at her sister, really looked at her. Sarah, who had spent their entire childhood being angry that Elena got better grades. Sarah, who had refused to attend Elena's wedding because Mark's job made more money than her boyfriend's. Sarah, who had called Elena a snob when Elena bought the house in the suburbs. "The police are already looking at the evidence," Elena said finally. "They have the photos from the bank. They have Martha's confession on tape. They have Arthur's testimony, which he's giving in exchange for a reduced sentence. And they will eventually find your involvement. It's not a question of if. It's a question of when." Sarah's hands were shaking. "You have two options," Elena continued. "Option 1. You wait for the police to come to you, and you go to trial, and you spend however many years in prison that the judge decides is appropriate for conspiracy to commit fraud and elder financial abuse. Option 2. You go to the police yourself, you admit your involvement, and you cooperate fully in their investigation. Your sentence will be shorter. It might even be probation. Elena. You have until tomorrow noon, Elena said, her voice cutting through Sarah's attempt to speak. After that, I'm giving the investigator permission to send everything to the district attorney. After that, you're on your own. Sarah left without speaking. Elena watched her get into her car and drive away. She didn't know if Sarah would take the offer. She didn't particularly care anymore. The machinery was already in motion. The police had what they needed. Justice, or something close to it, was already rolling forward like an inevitable tide. Elena walked to the console table by the front door. She picked up the silver keys that Martha had dropped there that morning, and she threw them directly into the trash. She returned to the kitchen, where the sunlight was streaming through the window and the espresso machine sat waiting on the counter, its metal surface reflecting the light back at her like a mirror. She pressed the start button. The machine hummed and vibrated beneath her palm. Steam rose from the nozzle. Coffee began to drip into the small white cup. Drip, drip, drip. Outside, the world continued its rotation. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The garden dried. A neighbor walked by with a dog. The day was becoming ordinary again, the way days do when the extraordinary has already been lived through and survived. Elena leaned against the white marble counter and waited for her coffee to finish brewing. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know if the trial would be brief or lengthy, if Mark would spend time in prison, or if he would somehow escape with a suspended sentence. She didn't know if her sister would take the offered lifeline or if she would face the consequences of her choices. But she knew this. She was still here. The house was still hers. And tomorrow, if she wanted to, she could have coffee at 7:30 in the morning with no one to interrupt her. She could open her closet and find her own clothes hanging untouched. She could walk to the front door and open it and step outside and no one would stop her. The espresso finished brewing. She picked up the small white cup and brought it to her lips. The coffee was hot, perfect, exactly the way she liked it. She stood at the window and drank it slowly, watching the garden dry in the sun, watching the world become ordinary again, watching herself become someone new, not healed, not hopeful, not ready for anything except this moment, this coffee, this silence that was finally, blessedly, entirely her own.